Thomas Paine, born Thomas Paine, February 9, 1737, June 8, 1809, was an English-born American political activist, philosopher, political theorist, and revolutionary. He authored the two most influential pamphlets at the start of the American Revolution and inspired the patriots in 1776 to declare independence from Great Britain. His ideas reflected Enlightenment-era ideals of transnational human rights. Historian Saul K. Padover described him as a corsetmaker by trade, a journalist by profession, and a propagandist by inclination. Born in Thetford in the English county of Norfolk, Paine migrated to the British American colonies in 1774 with the help of Benjamin Franklin, arriving just in time to participate in the American Revolution. Virtually every rebel read, or listened to a reading of, his powerful pamphlet Common Sense, 1776, proportionally the all-time best-selling American title, which crystallized the rebellious demand for independence from Great Britain. His The American Crisis, 1776–1783, was a pro-revolutionary pamphlet series. Common Sense was so influential that John Adams said, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." Paine lived in France for most of the 1790s, becoming deeply involved in the French Revolution. He wrote Rights of Man, 1791, in part a defense of the French Revolution against its critics. His attacks on Anglo-Irish conservative writer Edmund Burke led to a trial and conviction in absentia in England in 1792 for the crime of seditious libel. The British government of William Pitt the Younger, worried by the possibility that the French Revolution might spread to England, had begun suppressing works that espoused radical philosophies. Paine's work, which advocated the right of the people to overthrow their government, was duly targeted, with a writ for his arrest issued in early 1792. Paine fled to France in September where, despite not being able to speak French, he was quickly elected to the French National Convention. The Girondists regarded him as an ally. Consequently, the Montagnards, especially Maximilien Robespierre, regarded him as an enemy. In December 1793, he was arrested and was taken to Luxembourg prison in Paris. While in prison, he continued to work on The Age of Reason, 1793–1794. James Monroe, a future president of the United States, used his diplomatic connections to get Paine released in November 1794. Paine became notorious because of his pamphlets. The Age of Reason, in which he advocated deism, promoted reason and free thought and argued against institutionalized religion in general and Christian doctrine in particular. He published the pamphlet Agrarian Justice, 1797, discussing the origins of property and introduced the concept of a guaranteed minimum income through a one-time inheritance tax on landowners. In 1802, he returned to the U.S. where he died on June 8, 1809. Only 6 people attended his funeral as he had been ostracized for his ridicule of Christianity. Early life and education. Thomas Paine was born on January 29, 1736, and February 9, 1737, the son of Joseph Paine, a tenant farmer and staymaker, and Frances, née Coke, Paine, in Thetford, Norfolk, England. Joseph was a Quaker and Frances an Anglican. Despite claims that Thomas changed the spelling of his family name upon his emigration to America in 1774, he was using Paine in 1769, while still in Lewes, Sussex. He attended Thetford Grammar School, 1744–1749, at a time when there was no compulsory education. At the age of 13, he was apprenticed to his father, a staymaker. Following his apprenticeship, aged 19, Thomas enlisted and briefly served as a privateer, before returning to Britain in 1759. There, he became a master staymaker, establishing a shop in Sandwich, Kent. On September 27, 1759, Thomas Paine married Mary Lambert. His business collapsed soon after. Mary became pregnant, and, after they moved to Margate, she went into early labor, in which she and their child died. In July 1761, Paine returned to Thetford to work as a supernumerary officer. In December 1762, he became an excise officer in Grantham, Lincolnshire. In August 1764, he was transferred to Alford, also in Lincolnshire, at a salary of £50 per annum. On August 27, 1765, he was dismissed as an excise officer for claiming to have inspected goods he did not inspect. On July 31, 1766, He requested his reinstatement from the Board of Excise, which they granted the next day, upon vacancy. While awaiting that, he worked as a staymaker. In 1767, he was appointed to a position in Graham Pound, Cornwall. Later he asked to leave this post to await a vacancy, and he became a school teacher in London. On February 19, 1768, he was appointed to Lewes in Sussex, a town with a tradition of opposition to the monarchy and pro-republican sentiments since the revolutionary decades of the 17th century. Here he lived above the 15th-century Bull House, the tobacco shop of Samuel Olive and Esther Olive. Paine first became involved in civic matters when he was based in Lewes. He appears in the town book as a member of the court leet, the governing body for the town. He was also a member of the parish vestry, an influential local church group whose responsibilities for parish business would include collecting taxes and tithes to distribute among the poor. On March 26, 1771, at age 34, he married Elizabeth Olive, his landlord's daughter. From 1772 to 1773, Paine joined excise officers asking Parliament for better pay and working conditions, publishing, in summer of 1772, The Case of the Officers of Excise, a 12-page article, and his first political work, spending the London winter distributing the 4,000 copies printed to the Parliament and others. In spring 1774, he was again dismissed from the excise service for being absent from his post without permission. His tobacco shop failed, too. On April 14, to avoid debtor's prison, he sold his household possessions to pay debts. On June 4, 1774, he formally separated from his wife Elizabeth and moved to London, where, in September, mathematician, Fellow of the Royal Society, and Commissioner of the Excise George Lewis Scott introduced him to Benjamin Franklin, who suggested emigration to British colonial America, and gave him a letter of recommendation. In October, Paine emigrated to the American colonies, arriving in Philadelphia on November 30, 1774. Pennsylvania Magazine. Paine barely survived the transatlantic voyage. The ship's water supplies were bad and typhoid fever killed 5 passengers. On arriving at Philadelphia, he was too sick to disembark. Benjamin Franklin's physician, there to welcome Paine to America, had him carried off ship. Paine took 6 weeks to recover. He became a citizen of Pennsylvania by taking the oath of allegiance at a very early period. In March 1775, he became editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, a position he conducted with considerable ability. Before Paine's arrival in America, 16 magazines had been founded in the colonies and ultimately failed, each featuring substantial content and reprints from England. In late 1774, Philadelphia printer Robert Aitken announced his plan to create what he called an American magazine with content derived from the colonies. Paine contributed 2 pieces to the magazine's inaugural issue dated January 1775, and Aitken hired Paine as the magazine's editor 1 month later. Under Paine's leadership, the magazine's readership rapidly expanded, achieving a greater circulation in the colonies than any American magazine up until that point. While Aitken had conceived of the magazine as non-political, Paine brought a strong political perspective to its content, writing in its first issue that every heart and hand seemed to be engaged in the interesting struggle for American liberty. Paine wrote in the Pennsylvania Magazine that such a publication should become a nursery of genius to help America outgrow the state of infancy, exercising and educating American minds, and shaping American morality. On March 8, 1775, the Pennsylvania Magazine published an unsigned abolitionist essay titled African Slavery in America. The essay is often attributed to Paine on the basis of a letter by Benjamin Rush, recalling Paine's claim of authorship to the essay. The essay attacked slavery as an execrable commerce and outrage against humanity and justice. Consciously appealing to a broader and more working-class audience, Paine also used the magazine to discuss worker rights to production. This shift in the conceptualization of politics has been described as a part of the modernization of political consciousness, and the mobilization of ever greater sections of society into political life. American Revolution. Common Sense, 1776. Paine has a claim to the title the father of the American Revolution, which rests on his pamphlets, especially Common Sense, which crystallized sentiment for independence in 1776. It was published in Philadelphia on January 10, 1776, and signed anonymously by an Englishman. It became an immediate success, quickly spreading 100,000 copies in 3 months to the 2 million residents of the 13 colonies. During the course of the American Revolution, a total of about 500,000 copies were sold, including unauthorized editions. Paine's original title for the pamphlet was Plain Truth, but Paine's friend, pro-independence advocate Benjamin Rush, suggested Common Sense instead. The pamphlet came into circulation in January 1776, after the Revolution had started. It was passed around and often read aloud in taverns, contributing significantly to spreading the idea of republicanism, bolstering enthusiasm for separation from Britain, and encouraging recruitment for the Continental Army. Paine provided a new and convincing argument for independence by advocating a complete break with history. Common Sense is oriented to the future in a way that compels the reader to make an immediate choice. It offers a solution for Americans disgusted with and alarmed at the threat of tyranny. Paine's attack on monarchy and common sense is essentially an attack on George III. Whereas colonial resentments were originally directed primarily against the king's ministers and parliament, Paine laid the responsibility firmly at the king's door. Common Sense was the most widely read pamphlet of the American Revolution. It was a clarion call for unity against the corrupt British court, so as to realize America's providential role in providing an asylum for liberty. Written in a direct and lively style, it denounced the decaying despotisms of Europe and pilloried hereditary monarchy as an absurdity. At a time when many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, Common Sense demonstrated to many the inevitability of separation. Paine was not on the whole expressing original ideas in Common Sense, but rather employing rhetoric as a means to arouse resentment of the crown. To achieve these ends, he pioneered a style of political writing suited to the democratic society he envisioned, with Common Sense serving as a primary example. Part of Paine's work was to render complex ideas intelligible to average readers of the day, with clear, concise writing unlike the formal, learned style favored by many of Paine's contemporaries. Scholars have put forward various explanations to account for its success, including the historic moment, Paine's easy-to-understand style, his democratic ethos, and his use of psychology and ideology. Common Sense was immensely popular in disseminating to a very wide audience ideas that were already in common use among the elite who comprised Congress and the leadership cadre of the emerging nation, who rarely cited Paine's arguments in their public calls for independence. The pamphlet probably had little direct influence on the Continental Congress' decision to issue a Declaration of Independence, since that body was more concerned with how declaring independence would affect the war effort. One distinctive idea in Common Sense is Paine's beliefs regarding the peaceful nature of republics. His views were an early and strong conception of what scholars would come to call the democratic peace theory. Loyalists vigorously attacked Common Sense. One attack, titled Plain Truth, 1776, by Marylander James Chalmers, said Paine was a political quack and warned that without monarchy, the government would degenerate into democracy. Even some American revolutionaries objected to Common Sense. Late in life John Adams called it a crapulous mass. Adams disagreed with the type of radical democracy promoted by Paine, that men who did not own property should still be allowed to vote and hold public office, and published Thoughts on Government in 1776 to advocate a more conservative approach to republicanism. Sophia Rosenfeld argues that Paine was highly innovative in his use of the commonplace notion of common sense. He synthesized various philosophical and political uses of the term in a way that permanently impacted American political thought. He used two ideas from Scottish common sense realism, that ordinary people can indeed make sound judgments on major political issues, and that there exists a body of popular wisdom that is readily apparent to anyone. Paine also used a notion of common sense favored by philosophers in the Continental Enlightenment. They held that common sense could refute the claims of traditional institutions. Thus, Paine used common sense as a weapon to delegitimize the monarchy and overturn prevailing conventional wisdom. Rosenfeld concludes that the phenomenal appeal of his pamphlet resulted from his synthesis of popular and elite elements in the independence movement. According to historian Robert Middlecoff, Common Sense became immensely popular mainly because Paine appealed to widespread convictions. Monarchy, he said, was preposterous and it had a heathenish origin. It was an institution of the devil. Paine pointed to the Old Testament, where almost all kings had seduced the Israelites to worship idols instead of God. Paine also denounced aristocracy, which together with monarchy were two ancient tyrannies. They violated the laws of nature, human reason, and the universal order of things, which began with God. That was, Middlecoff says, exactly what most Americans wanted to hear. He calls the revolutionary generation the children of the twice-born. because in their childhood they had experienced the Great Awakening, which, for the first time, had tied Americans together, transcending denominational and ethnic boundaries and giving them a sense of patriotism. The American Crisis, 1776. In late 1776, Paine published the American Crisis pamphlet series to inspire the Americans in their battles against the British Army. He juxtaposed the conflict between the good American devoted to civic virtue and the selfish provincial man. To inspire his soldiers, General George Washington had the American Crisis, first crisis pamphlet, read aloud to them. It begins. Foreign Affairs. In 1777, Paine became Secretary of the Congressional Committee on Foreign Affairs. The following year, he alluded to secret negotiation underway with France in his pamphlets. His enemies denounced his indiscretions. There was scandal, together with Paine's conflict with Robert Morris and Silestine. It led to Paine's expulsion from the committee in 1779. However, in 1781, he accompanied John Lawrence on his mission to France. Eventually, after much pleading from Paine, New York State recognized his political services by presenting him with an estate at New Rochelle, New York, and Paine received money from Pennsylvania and from Congress at Washington's suggestion. During the Revolutionary War, Paine served as an aide-de-camp to the important general, Nathanael Greene. The Silestine Affair. In what may have been an error, and perhaps even contributed to his resignation as the Secretary to the Committee of Foreign Affairs, Paine was openly critical of Silestine, an American diplomat who had been appointed in March 1776 by the Congress to travel to France in secret. Dean's goal was to influence the French government to finance the colonists in their fight for independence. Paine largely saw Dean as a war profiteer who had little respect for principle, having been under the employ of Robert Morris, one of the primary financiers of the American Revolution, and working with Pierre Beaumarchais, a French royal agent sent to the colonies by King Louis to investigate the Anglo-American conflict. Paine labeled Dean as unpatriotic, and demanded that there be a public investigation into Morris' financing of the revolution, as he had contracted with his own company for around $500,000. Unfortunately, Paine's criticisms turned against him. Amongst his criticisms, he had written in the Pennsylvania Packet that France had prefaced alliance by an early and generous friendship, referring to aid that had been provided to American colonies prior to the recognition of the Franco-American treaties. This was effectively an embarrassment to France, which potentially could have jeopardized the alliance. John Jay, the president of the Congress, who had been a fervent supporter of Dean, immediately spoke out against Paine's comments. The controversy eventually became public, and Paine was then denounced as unpatriotic for criticizing an American revolutionary. He was even physically assaulted twice in the street by Dean supporters. This much added stress took a large toll on Paine, who was generally of a sensitive character, and he resigned as Secretary to the Committee of Foreign Affairs in 1779. Funding the Revolution. Paine accompanied Colonel John Lawrence to France and is credited with initiating the mission. It landed in France in March 1781 and returned to America in August with 2.5 million livres in silver, as part of a present of 6 million and a loan of 10 million. The meetings with the French king were most likely conducted in the company and under the influence of Benjamin Franklin. Upon returning to the United States with this highly welcomed cargo, Thomas Paine and probably Saul Lawrence positively objected that General Washington should propose that Congress remunerate him for his services, for fear of setting a bad precedent in an improper mode. Paine made influential acquaintances in Paris and helped organize the Bank of North America to raise money to supply the army. In 1785, he was given $3,000 by the U.S. Congress in recognition of his service to the nation. Henry Lawrence, father of Colonel John Lawrence, had been the ambassador to the Netherlands, but he was captured by the British on his return trip there. When he was later exchanged for the prisoner Lord Cornwallis, in late 1781, Paine proceeded to the Netherlands to continue the loan negotiations. There remains some question as to the relationship of Henry Lawrence and Thomas Paine to Robert Morris as the superintendent of finance and his business associate Thomas Willing, who became the first president of the Bank of North America, in January 1782. They had accused Morris of profiteering in 1779, and Willing had voted against the Declaration of Independence. Although Morris did much to restore his reputation in 1780 and 1781, the credit for obtaining these critical loans to organize the Bank of North America for approval by Congress in December 1781 should go to Henry or John Lawrence and Thomas Paine more than to Robert Morris. Paine bought his only house in 1783 on the corner of Farnsworth Avenue and Church Streets in Bordentown City, New Jersey, and he lived in it periodically until his death in 1809. This is the only place in the world where Paine purchased real estate. In 1787, a bridge of Paine's design was built across the Schuylkill River at Philadelphia. At this time his work on single-arch iron bridges led him back to Paris, France. Because Paine had few friends when arriving in France aside from Lafayette and Jefferson, he continued to correspond heavily with Benjamin Franklin, a longtime friend and mentor. Franklin provided letters of introduction for Paine to use to gain associates and contacts in France. Later that year, Paine returned to London from Paris. He then released a pamphlet on August 20 called Prospects on the Rubicon, or An Investigation into the Causes and Consequences of the Politics to be Agitated at the Meeting of Parliament. Tensions between England and France were increasing, and this pamphlet urged the British ministry to reconsider the consequences of war with France. Paine sought to turn the public opinion against the war to create better relations between the countries, avoid the taxes of war upon the citizens, and not engage in a war he believed would ruin both nations. Rights of Man. Back in London by 1787, Paine would become engrossed in the French Revolution after it began in 1789, and decided to travel to France in 1790. Meanwhile, conservative intellectual Edmund Burke launched a counter-revolutionary blast against the French Revolution, entitled Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, which strongly appealed to the landed class, and sold 30,000 copies. Paine set out to refute it in his Rights of Man, 1791. He wrote it not as a quick pamphlet, but as a long, abstract political tract of 90,000 words which tore apart monarchies and traditional social institutions. On January 31, 1791, he gave the manuscript to publisher Joseph Johnson. A visit by government agents dissuaded Johnson, so Paine gave the book to publisher J.S. Jordan, then went to Paris, per William Blake's advice. He charged three good friends, William Godwin, Thomas Brand Hollis, and Thomas Holcroft, with handling publication details. The book appeared on March 13, 1791 and sold nearly 1 million copies. It was eagerly read by reformers, Protestant dissenters, Democrats, London craftsmen, and the skilled factory hands of the new industrial North. Undeterred by the government campaign to discredit him, Paine issued his Rights of Man, Part II, combining principle and practice in February 1792. It detailed the representative government with enumerated social programs to remedy the numbing poverty of commoners through progressive tax measures. Radically reduced in price to ensure unprecedented circulation, it was sensational in its impact and gave birth to reform societies. An indictment for seditious libel followed, for both publisher and author, while government agents followed Paine and instigated mobs, hate meetings, and burnings in effigy. A fierce pamphlet war also resulted, in which Paine was defended and assailed in dozens of works. The authorities aimed, with ultimate success, to chase Paine out of Great Britain. He was then tried in absentia and found guilty, although never executed. The French translation of Rights of Man, Part II was published in April 1792. The translator, François Lanthines, eliminated the dedication to Lafayette, as he believed Paine thought too highly of Lafayette, who was seen as a royalist sympathizer at the time. In summer of 1792, he answered the sedition and libel charges thus: if, to expose the fraud and imposition of monarchy, to promote universal peace, civilization, and commerce, and to break the chains of political superstition, and raise degraded man to his proper rank, if these things be libelous, let the name of libeller be engraved on my tomb. Paine was an enthusiastic supporter of the French Revolution, and was granted honorary French citizenship alongside prominent contemporaries such as Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin and others. Paine's honorary citizenship was in recognition of the publishing of his Rights of Man, Part II, and the sensation it created within France. Despite his inability to speak French, he was elected to the National Convention, representing the district of Pas-de-Calais. Several weeks after his election to the National Convention, Paine was selected as one of 9 deputies to be part of the convention's Constitutional Committee, who were charged to draft a suitable constitution for the French Republic. He subsequently participated in the Constitutional Committee in drafting the Girondin constitutional project. He voted for the French Republic, but argued against the execution of Louis XVI, saying the monarch should instead be exiled to the United States, Firstly, because of the way royalist France had come to the aid of the American Revolution, and secondly, because of a moral objection to capital punishment in general and to revenge killings in particular. However, Paine's speech in defense of Louis XVI was interrupted by Jean-Paul Marat, who claimed that as a Quaker, Paine's religious beliefs ran counter to inflicting capital punishment and thus he should be ineligible to vote. Marat interrupted a second time, stating that the translator was deceiving the convention by distorting the meanings of Paine's words, prompting Paine to provide a copy of the speech as proof that he was being correctly translated. Regarded as an ally of the Girondins, he was seen with increasing disfavor by the Montagnards, who were now in power, and in particular by Maximilien Robespierre. A decree was passed at the end of 1793 excluding foreigners from their places in the convention. Anacharsis Cloots was also deprived of his place. Paine was arrested and imprisoned in December 1793. Paine wrote the second part of Rights of Man on a desk in Thomas Clio Rickman's house, with whom he was staying in 1792 before he fled to France. This desk is currently on display in the People's History Museum in Manchester. The Age of Reason. Paine was arrested in France on December 28, 1793. Joe Barlow was unsuccessful in securing Paine's release by circulating a petition among American residents in Paris. 16 American citizens were allowed to plead for Paine's release to the convention, yet President Marc-Guillaume Alexis Vadier of the Committee of General Security refused to acknowledge Paine's American citizenship, stating he was an Englishman and a citizen of a country at war with France. Paine himself protested and claimed that he was a citizen of the U.S., which was an ally of revolutionary France, rather than of Great Britain, which was by that time at war with France. However, Gouverneur Morris, the American minister to France, did not press his claim, and Paine later wrote that Morris had connived at his imprisonment. Paine narrowly escaped execution. A chalk mark was supposed to be left by the jailer on the door of a cell to denote that the prisoner inside was due to be removed for execution. In Paine's case, the mark had accidentally been made on the inside of his door rather than the outside. This was due to the fact that the door of Paine's cell had been left open whilst the jailer was making his rounds that day, since Paine had been receiving official visitors. But for this quirk of fate, Paine would have been executed the following morning. He kept his head and survived the few vital days needed to be spared by the fall of Robespierre on 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794. Paine was released in November 1794 largely because of the work of the new American minister to France, James Monroe, who successfully argued the case for Paine's American citizenship. In July 1795, he was readmitted into the convention, as were other surviving Girondins. Paine was one of only 3 deputies to oppose the adoption of the new 1795 Constitution because it eliminated universal suffrage, which had been proclaimed by the Montagnard Constitution of 1793. In 1796, a bridge he designed was erected over the mouth of the Ware River at Sunderland, Tyne, and Ware, England. This bridge, the Sunderland Arch, was after the same design as his Schuylkill River Bridge in Philadelphia, and it became the prototype for many subsequent voussoir arches made in iron and steel. In addition to receiving a British patent for the single-span iron bridge, Paine developed a smokeless candle and worked with inventor John Fitch in developing steam engines. In 1797, Paine lived in Paris with Nicolas Bonneville and his wife. As well as Bonneville's other controversial guests, Paine aroused the suspicions of authorities. Bonneville hid the royalist Antoine-Joseph Barruel Bouvard at his home. Bouvard had been outlawed following the coup of 18 Fructidor on September 4, 1797. Paine believed that the United States under President John Adams had betrayed revolutionary France. Bonneville was then briefly jailed and his presses were confiscated, which meant financial ruin. In 1800, still under police surveillance, Bonneville took refuge with his father in Évreux. Paine stayed on with him, helping Bonneville with the burden of translating the Covenancy. The same year, Paine purportedly had a meeting with Napoleon. Napoleon claimed he slept with a copy of Rights of Man under his pillow and went so far as to say to Paine that a statue of gold should be erected to you in every city in the universe. Paine discussed with Napoleon how best to invade England. In December 1797, he wrote 2 essays, one of which was pointedly named Observations on the Construction and Operation of Navies with a Plan for an Invasion of England and the Final Overthrow of the English Government, in which he promoted the idea to finance 1,000 gunboats to carry a French invading army across the English Channel. In 1804, Paine returned to the subject, writing to the people of England on the invasion of England advocating the idea. However, upon noting Napoleon's progress towards dictatorship, he condemned him as the completest charlatan that ever existed. Paine remained in France until 1802, returning to the United States only at President Jefferson's invitation. Criticism of George Washington. Paine believed that U.S. President George Washington had conspired with Robespierre to imprison him. He had felt largely betrayed that Washington, who had been a lifelong friend, did nothing while Paine suffered in prison. While staying with Monroe, he planned to send Washington a letter of grievance on the former president's birthday. Monroe stopped the letter from being sent just in time, and after Paine's criticism of the Jay Treaty, Monroe suggested that Paine reside somewhere else. Still embittered by the perceived betrayal, Paine tried to ruin Washington's reputation by calling him a treacherous man who was unworthy of his fame as a military and political hero. He sent a stinging letter to Washington, in which he described him as an incompetent commander and a vain and ungrateful person. Paine never received a reply, so he contacted his lifelong publisher, the anti-federalist Benjamin Bache, to publish this letter to George Washington in 1796. In this scathing publication, Paine wrote that the world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an impostor, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. He further wrote that without the aid of France, Washington could not have succeeded in the revolution and had but little share in the glory of the final event. He also commented on Washington's poor character, saying that Washington had no sympathetic feelings and was a hypocrite. Later years. In 1802 or 1803, Paine left France for the United States, also paying the passage for Bonneville's wife Marguerite Brazier and the couple's three sons, Benjamin, Louis, and Thomas Bonneville, to whom Paine was godfather. Paine returned to the United States in the early stages of the Second Great Awakening and a time of great political partisanship. The Age of Reason gave ample excuse for the religiously devout to dislike him, and the Federalists attacked him for his ideas of government stated in common sense, for his association with the French Revolution, and for his friendship with President Jefferson. Also still fresh in the minds of the public was his letter to Washington, published 6 years before his return. This was compounded when his right to vote was denied in New Rochelle on the grounds that Gouverneur Morris did not recognize him as an American and Washington had not aided him. Brazier took care of Paine at the end of his life and buried him after his death on June 8, 1809. In his will, Paine left the bulk of his estate to Marguerite, including 100 acres, 40.5 hectares, of his farm so she could maintain and educate Benjamin and his brother Thomas. In 1814, the fall of Napoleon finally allowed Bonneville to rejoin his wife in the United States, where he remained for 4 years before returning to Paris to open a bookshop. Death. On the morning of June 8, 1809, Paine died, aged 72, at 59 Grove Street in Greenwich Village, New York City. Although the original building is no longer there, the present building has a plaque noting that Paine died at this location. After his death, Paine's body was brought to New Rochelle, but the Quakers would not allow it to be buried in their graveyard as per his last will, so his remains were buried under a walnut tree on his farm. In 1819, English agrarian radical journalist William Cobbett, who in 1793 had published a hostile continuation of Francis Oldie's George Chalmers' The Life of Thomas Paine, dug up his bones and transported them back to England with the intention to give Paine a heroic reburial on his native soil, but this never came to pass. The bones were still among Cobbett's effects when he died over 15 years later, but were later lost. There is no confirmed story about what happened to them after that, although various people have claimed throughout the years to own parts of Paine's remains, such as his skull and right hand. At the time of his death, most American newspapers reprinted the obituary notice from the New York Evening Post that was in turn quoting from the American Citizen, which read in part, "He had lived long, did some good, and much harm." Only 6 mourners came to his funeral, 2 of whom were black, most likely freedmen. Many years later, the writer and orator Robert G. Ingersoll wrote, Ideas. Biographer Eric Foner identifies a utopian thread in Paine's thought, writing, "Through this new language he communicated a new vision, a utopian image of an egalitarian, republican society." Paine's utopianism combined civic republicanism, belief in the inevitability of scientific and social progress, and commitment to free markets and liberty generally. The multiple sources of Paine's political theory all pointed to a society based on the common good and individualism. Paine expressed a redemptive futurism or political messianism. Writing that his generation would appear to the future as the Adam of a new world, Paine exemplified British utopianism. Later, his encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Americas made a deep impression. The ability of the Iroquois to live in harmony with nature while achieving a democratic decision-making process helped him refine his thinking on how to organize society. Slavery. On March 8, 1775, 1 month after Paine became the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine, the magazine published an anonymous article titled African Slavery in America, the first prominent piece in the colonies proposing the emancipation of African American slaves and the abolition of slavery. Paine is often credited with writing the piece, on the basis of later testimony by Benjamin Rush, co-signer of the Declaration of Independence. Citing a lack of further evidence of Paine's authorship, however, scholars Foner and Alfred Owen Aldridge no longer consider it to be one of his works. By contrast, journalist John Nichols writes that Paine's fervent objections to slavery led to his exclusion from power during the early years of the Republic. Agrarian Justice. His last pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, published in the winter of 1795, opposed to agrarian law and to agrarian monopoly and further developed his ideas in the Rights of Man about how land ownership separated the majority of people from their rightful, natural inheritance and means of independent survival. The U.S. Social Security Administration recognizes agrarian justice as the first American proposal for an old age pension and basic income or citizens' dividend. Per agrarian justice. Note that £10 and £15 would be worth about £800 and £1,200, $1,200 and $2,000, when adjusted for inflation, 2011 British pounds sterling. Lamb argues that Paine's analysis of property rights marks a distinct contribution to political theory. His theory of property defends a libertarian concern with private ownership that shows an egalitarian commitment. Paine's new justification of property sets him apart from previous theorists such as Hugo Grotius, Samuel von Pufendorf and John Locke. It demonstrates Paine's commitment to foundational liberal values of individual freedom and moral equality. Religious views. Before his arrest and imprisonment in France, knowing that he would probably be arrested and executed, following in the tradition of early 18th century British deism, Paine wrote the first part of The Age of Reason, an assault on organized revealed religion combining a compilation of the many inconsistencies he found in the Bible. About his own religious beliefs, Paine wrote in The Age of Reason. Though there is no evidence Paine himself was a Freemason, upon his return to America from France he also penned an essay on the origin of Freemasonry, 1803 to 1805, about Freemasonry being derived from the religion of the ancient Druids. In the essay, he stated, "The Christian religion is a parody on the worship of the sun, in which they put a man called Christ in the place of the sun, and pay him the adoration originally paid to the sun." Marguerite de Bonneville published the essay in 1810 after Paine's death, but she chose to omit certain passages from it that were critical of Christianity, most of which were restored in an 1818 printing. While Paine never described himself as a deist, he did write the following. Legacy. Historian Jack P. Green stated, Harvey J.K. wrote that through Paine, through his pamphlets and catchphrases such as "the sun never shined on a cause of greater worth," we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And these are the times that Trimen's souls did more than move Americans to declare their independence. John Stevenson argues that in the early 1790s, numerous radical political societies were formed throughout England and Wales in which Paine's writings provided a boost to the self-confidence of those seeking to participate in politics for the first time. In its immediate effects, Gary Cates argues, Paine's vision unified Philadelphia merchants, British artisans, French peasants, Dutch reformers, and radical intellectuals from Boston to Berlin in one great movement. His writings in the long term inspired philosophic and working-class radicals in Britain and the United States. Liberals, libertarians, left libertarians, feminists, democratic socialists, social democrats, anarchists, freethinkers and progressives often claim him as an intellectual ancestor. Paine's critique of institutionalized religion and advocacy of rational thinking influenced many British freethinkers in the 19th and 20th centuries, such as William Cobbett, George Holyoake, Charles Bradlaugh, Christopher Hitchens, and Bertrand Russell. The quote "lead, follow, or get out of the way" is widely but incorrectly attributed to Paine. It can be found nowhere in his published works. Abraham Lincoln. In 1835, when Abraham Lincoln was 26 years old, he wrote a defense of Paine's deism. A political associate, Samuel Hill, burned the manuscript to save Lincoln's political career. Historian Roy Bosler, the editor of Lincoln's papers, said Paine had a strong influence on Lincoln's style. Thomas Edison. the inventor Thomas Edison said. South America. In 1811, Venezuelan translator Manuel Garcia de Sena published a book in Philadelphia that consisted mostly of Spanish translations of several of Paine's most important works. The book also included translations of the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution and the constitutions of 5 U.S. states. It subsequently circulated widely in South America, and through it Uruguayan national hero José Gervasio Artigas became familiar with and embraced Paine's ideas. In turn, many of Artigas's writings drew directly from Paine's, including the Instructions of 1813, which Uruguayans consider to be one of their country's most important constitutional documents, was one of the earliest writings to articulate a principled basis for an identity independent of Buenos Aires. Memorials. The first and longest-standing memorial to Paine is the carved and inscribed 12-foot marble column in New Rochelle, New York, organized and funded by publisher, educator and reformer Gilbert Vale, 1791–1866, and raised in 1839 by the American sculptor and architect John Frazee, the Thomas Paine Monument, see image below. New Rochelle is also the original site of Thomas Paine's cottage, which along with a 320-acre, 130 hectares, farm were presented to Paine in 1784 by act of the New York State Legislature for his services in the American Revolution. The same site is the home of the Thomas Paine Memorial Museum. Thomas Edison helped to turn the first shovel of earth for the museum, which serves as a museum to display both Paine relics as well as others of local historical interest. A large collection of books, pamphlets, and pictures is contained in the Paine Library, including many first editions of Paine's works as well as several original manuscripts. The holdings, the subject of a sell-off controversy, were temporarily relocated to the New York Historical Society and have since been more permanently archived in the Iona College Library nearby. Paine was originally buried near the current location of his house and monument upon his death in 1809. The site is marked by a small headstone and burial plaque, even though his remains were removed years later. In the 20th century, Joseph Lewis, longtime president of the Freethinkers of America and an ardent Paine admirer, was instrumental in having larger-than-life-sized statues of Paine erected in each of the 3 countries with which the revolutionary writer was associated. The first, created by Mount Rushmore sculptor Gutzon Borglum, was erected in Paris just before World War II began but not formally dedicated until 1948. It depicts Paine standing before the French National Convention to plead for the life of King Louis XVI. The second, sculpted in 1950 by Georg J. Lober, was erected near Paine's one-time home in Morristown, New Jersey. It shows a seated Paine using a drumhead as a makeshift table. The third, sculpted by Sir Charles Wheeler, President of the Royal Academy, was erected in 1964 in Paine's birthplace, Thetford, England. With quill pen in his right hand and an inverted copy of The Rights of Man in his left, it occupies a prominent spot on King Street. Thomas Paine was ranked number 34 in the 100 Greatest Britons 2002 extensive nationwide poll conducted by the BBC. A bronze plaque attached to the wall of Thetford's Thomas Paine Hotel gives details of Paine's life. It was placed there in 1943 by voluntary contributions from U.S. airmen from a nearby bomber base. Texas folklorist and freethinker J. Frank Dobie, then teaching at Cambridge University, participated in the dedication ceremonies. In New York City, the Thomas Paine Park is marked by a fountain called the Triumph of the Human Spirit. Located in downtown Manhattan, near City Hall, the 300-ton-plus monument was dedicated on October 12, 2000. Bronx Community College includes Paine in its Hall of Fame of Great Americans, and there are statues of Paine in Morristown and Bordentown, New Jersey, and in the Parc Montsouris, in Paris. In Paris, there is a plaque in the street where he lived from 1797 to 1802 that says, Thomas Paine, 1737 to 1809, Englishman by birth, American by adoption, French by decree. Yearly, between July 4th and 14th, the Lewis Town Council in the United Kingdom celebrates the life and work of Paine. In the early 1990s, largely through the efforts of citizen activist David Henley of Virginia, legislation, S-Con. Res. 110 and H.R. 1628, was introduced in the 102nd Congress by ideological opposites Senator Steve Sims, RID, and Representative Nita Lowey, DNY. With over 100 formal letters of endorsement by United States and foreign historians, philosophers and organizations, including the Thomas Paine National Historical Society, the legislation garnered 78 original co-sponsors in the Senate and 230 original co-sponsors in the House of Representatives, and was consequently passed by both houses' unanimous consent. In October 1992, the legislation was signed into law, PL 102-407 and PL 102-459, by President George H. W. Bush, authorizing the construction by using private funds of a memorial to Thomas Paine in Area 1 of the grounds of the U.S. Capitol. As of January 2011, the memorial has not yet been built. The University of East Anglia's Norwich Business School is housed in the Thomas Paine Study Center on its Norwich campus in Paine's home county of Norfolk. The Cook's House is reputed to have been his home during the Second Continental Congress at York, Pennsylvania. In popular culture, 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 at York, Pennsylvania.